clauses 1 and 2. The question is that clauses 1 and 2 stand part. Moana Maki.
Thank you, Mr Chair, and I'm happy to take a call on the title and commencement clauses of this particular piece of legislation. And it's the legislation is called the Taxation, Annual Rates and Budget Measures Bill. Well, I would submit, Mr Chair, that is not a particularly good name for this piece of legislation. It makes it seem like something fairly innocuous, when in fact what this bill is doing is breaking even more election promises that were made by this national government before the last election. It is dismantling KiwiSaver. It is making life harder for middle-income and lower-income families because of changes to working for families. And I don't think that Taxation, Annual Rates and Budget Measures Bill really accurately sums up exactly how damaging this piece of legislation is. Also, the word budget in the title of the bill, Mr Chair, may lead people to believe that this is something which is going to happen after the budget, rather than the reality, which is that we have another 6 months with no plan, another 6 months of treading water, while the government does absolutely nothing to address the dire economic circumstances that they have put this country into. And I think an accurate name for this piece of legislation would be the taxation. Lower and middle income families are going to pay for the tax cuts that went to high income families that National gave over the last 2 budgets, Bill, because that's what this piece of legislation does. We are having to pass legislation which cuts entitlements to KiwiSaver, which cuts entitlements to working for families, both of which National promised they would not do, because they gave 2 years' worth of completely unaffordable tax cuts, the overwhelming amount of which went to the top income earners, went to their mates, went to them. Cabinet ministers, MPs did very, very well out of the tax cuts given by the National government over the last 2 budgets. And Labor said they were unaffordable at the time. Labor said they were unaffordable. National knew they were unaffordable, but they went ahead with them anyway, and guess who's paying for them? Guess who's paying for those tax cuts? Guess who's paying for the economic mismanagement of this government? It's low and middle income families in New Zealand. And another potential title for this piece of legislation, Mr Chair, could be the taxation. This is going to be incredibly bad for local economies bill. Because if I look at working for families, my hometown of Gisborne, working for families puts approximately $40 million into the pockets of those families. In the Bay of Plenty, it's approximately $160 million. So when we start to cut into that, that's money that these families are not going to have to spend in local businesses, to spend on local services, to spend in the local economy. And provincial economies in New Zealand are already doing it tough because this government has no plan. I'm sure Sandra Gowdy has a plan, I'm sure she does, but the reality is that provincial New Zealand is finding it incredibly hard at the moment, and these changes will only make it harder. These changes to working for families are going to take money directly out of provincial economies. And let me remind the House again, what for? To pay for completely unaffordable tax cuts, 40% of which went to the top 10% of New Zealanders. So I think another name for this bill could be the taxation. These taxation changes are simply not fair, Bill, because they're not fair. When the overwhelming majority goes to the people who needed it the least and the people who weren't asking for it. And when we have to cut public services back to the bone, when we have to cut KiwiSaver, cut working for families, cut student loans to pay for them, that's not fair. And nothing in this budget, nothing in this piece of legislation is going to do anything to promote growth, is going to do anything to reduce unemployment. In fact, it's only going to contract regional economies further and make the existing problems worse. All to pay for tax cuts for National's rich mates, who did not need them, who still do not need them. And National would stand up in this House and defend that. Well, I don't think that is defendable, Mr Chair. Now, the other title could be the KiwiSaver Forget About It If You're Self-Employed Bill, because the self-employed are really going to suffer under these KiwiSaver changes, because they relied on that government tax credit, because they are their own employer. So when the government says, well, we're actually now stripping away that government tax credit, their savings will go down by 25%. 25% is how much, Mr Chair, thank you, 25%. And you look at the gentleman who was in the New Zealand Herald today saying it's just not worth it anymore. It was the government's input into KiwiSaver that made it worthwhile saving. And now, whereas the government would have us... Are you saying he's wrong, Mr Tremaine? Is this man not telling the truth? Is this man not telling the truth? Well, Chris Tremaine and the National Party say that the self-employed man in the New Zealand Herald today who said that his savings will go down by 25%, they're not offset by an employer contribution. And let's be realistic, even in the case of the employer contribution, when we're talking about employer contributions, those are going to be offset by wages. So the changes here are actually going to see wages decrease as a result of these changes, decrease. This is the great grand plan, apparently. This is the bright new future of the National Party. So I want to put it to the Minister and the Chair. This is bad for regional economies, absolutely bad. That's why I think that should be reflected in the title of this bill, because they're also going to suffer from cuts that were announced in the budget yesterday to public services, $1 billion worth of cuts. Guess what? They've spent that money already in the budget. They don't know where those cuts are coming from. They haven't told us. They haven't told the New Zealand public. They're going to come from health. They're going to come from education. That's extra costs on families who are receiving working for families who have had their entitlements cut. So that's going to make their lives even harder when it comes to making ends meet. That's going to mean even less money going into local economies, which is going to make unemployment worse, going to make that backwards move in growth in provincial New Zealand even worse. Now, I welcome the next National Speaker telling us where those $1 billion worth of cuts are going to come from in the public sector, because they've spent them already. The budget spent that money already, so they better hope that they can find them, otherwise they're going to find themselves in a whole lot of trouble. But the point is, it makes it so much harder for those families on working for families to make ends meet, and it's going to mean less money going into provincial economies and the economy in its entirety, Mr Chair. Now, I think that perhaps another name for this piece of legislation could be the taxation, and I take this from my colleague Damien O'Connor before, that the taxation saving national, not national savings bill. Because essentially that's what this is about. It is a gamble. It is a gamble. They gave away unaffordable tax cuts that everyone told them they couldn't afford. They've done nothing for 2.5 years, nothing to stimulate growth, nothing to bring New Zealand aggressively out of recession as we were told we were going to be 2 years ago. Absolutely nothing. What we had a jobs summit that created no jobs. We had a cycleway to nowhere, and that's it. That's it. They've cut back industry training, cut science and innovation, cut all the areas that normally create jobs, and then sit there and wonder why unemployment continues to rise, why more than 25% of young people in New Zealand are unemployed. That's a social disaster waiting to happen. Sitting there, not in training, not learning, not in employment, and nothing in this bill is going to do anything to change that. In fact, it's only going to make it worse. It's only going to make it worse. So I suggest again, Mr Chair, that maybe this could be the taxation. Finally, everyone can see the government has no plan, the Emperor has no clothes, and this is nothing more, this piece of legislation, than a political smokescreen. A political smokescreen. Because when you say that this was a savings budget, why would the first piece of legislation that you introduce under urgency be cutting KiwiSaver? A savings budget that cuts KiwiSaver. That cuts KiwiSaver. Even the New Zealand Herald has seen through that piece of spin. The New Zealand Herald, normally very friendly to the National Party, even they have seen through that piece of spin. Sandra Gowdy says the New Zealand Herald doesn't understand how the economy works. Doesn't understand how the economy works. Well, I'm sorry that Sandra Gowdy is retiring from Parliament, because that woman was heading straight for the front bench. Straight for the front bench, I tell you. The reality is, Miss Gowdy, Mr Hutchison thought that was funny. The reality is that Labor left this national government with an economy that the IMF and that Bill English said was in an excellent position to weather the recession. One of the lowest government debts in the world. We were in a net positive position. We had one of the lowest unemployment rates in the world. And what has this government done? They have frittered it away. frittered it away because they've had no plan, frittered it away because they gave all the money in tax cuts to people who did not need it, to people who did not spend it in our economy, to people who did not use it in a way that was productive for New Zealand, and that's why we're in the position we're in.
Dr. Paul Hutchison.